One more, there we are. Hello everyone and welcome to another amazing Gnomon live stream brought to you by Dell and NVIDIA. Before we get started, if you're looking for closed captioning, go ahead and head over to our YouTube and our Facebook page and we'll have closed captionings for you there. So, we're here, we're at the stage. I know you've been seeing me jump all over the place lately, but why are we here? Diablo, yo. What more can I say? I mean, this game, if you've played it, you know that it's amazing. If you haven't, you should play it right now. You should just go and do that. It's so great that our founder and president took a break from his immense work that he's been doing for our new campus. If you haven't seen the stuff about our new campus, go ahead and head over to gnomon.edu. And he took a break from working on the campus to play this game. Not only play it, but beat it. And it was cool because then we got to talk about builds. But if you want to know builds and being really good at the game, you should hit up our education lead, Max Diane. He is all about Diablo right now. So instead of talking about what is optimal and how you should build in Diablo 4, because I could do a whole live stream just on that, I really want to talk about how immersive this version of Diablo is. 4 is got just a massive world, and the biggest thing about Diablo is sucking you in, right? It's keeping you in there, so then after 6 hours you don't realize that you've been running hell tides and world events for that long and defeating world bosses. And part of that immersion is not only the sound and the feel and just everything is involved in that, and it's just great. It's amazing, and we actually have some of that amazing right here at the Gnomon campus right now. So without further ado, the team that is partially responsible for me neglecting my dog just a little bit, the Diablo 4 props and interactive team.
Thank you, and welcome to our panel on props and interactives. Thank you again for being here today, and hopefully through this presentation you'll learn a little bit about us, about Blizzard, about what we do, our special team culture on interactives, and really kind of go through the whole process with you, because I think you'll see in our presentation interactives is responsible for a lot. It's a big team, but we do a ton of work, so look forward to it. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce our panel. you may notice, wrong side, right? Starting with me all the way on the left, yeah, that's me, Chaz. And then we have Luciano, David, and Josh. And to talk about myself a little bit, you know, I love talking about myself. These guys know that. Yeah, I started at my career as an intern, actually. Oh, I'm supposed to announce my title. I am lead props and interactives artist. Apologies. But to continue, yeah, I started my got my start as an intern on the StarCraft 2 team. So on Wings of Liberty, if any StarCraft fans here? Yeah, so Wings of Liberty. I was a terrible artist, but luckily they kept me on, and I worked really hard and moved through it. And then I went on to work on Heart of the Swarm, which is the second expansion, and Legacy of the Void, the last expansion, as well as not confusing in any way, but Heroes of the Storm, which was kind of our MOBA type game. So all kind of RTS, kind of all isometric games, so I have a lot of experience in that arena. And then, yeah, eventually started on Team 3, which is the Diablo team. And I couldn't be happier. I just remember walking in and seeing Josh on the team and seeing the amazing art at the time. And I was just blown away by it. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was new to the next generation and of art, and it was really awesome seeing it. But yeah, that's me, Chaz, and let me pass it to Luciano.
Hello, my name is Luciano Di Fede. I was born in Italy, and from an early age, I kind of always been interested in art and video games, especially video games early on. And I played a lot of Diablo 2 growing up, and you know, eventually I found out you can actually get a career developing games. So I kind of directed my studies towards that. And you know, during university, I chose a program that offered 3D specialization. And over there, I met my wife. We're still married, and we eventually flew over the ocean and find our first big jobs here. I was at Sony Santa Monica. I worked on God of War. I worked on Jedi: The Fallen Order. And 4 years ago, I was hired at Blizzard as a cinematic modeler for our pre-render cinematic team. And I worked on a lot of the cinematics you've seen in the past 5 years. And about 2.5 years ago, I was hired as a prop interactive artist in this team, and it's been amazing. I've been learning a ton about rigging, animation, and making things explode, and a lot of gore, honestly. And yeah, that's me. I'm gonna pass it to David.
Cool, thank you, Luciano. Hello, my name is David 2. My friends call me D2, and I'm a props interactive artist. I'm a 90s kid, so you know, I'm super big into the old school kind of anime. For me, that's, you know, One Piece, Naruto. Any One Piece fan here, by any chance? Yes, let's go. Gear 5's so cool. I also just got like 2 new One Piece statues today. Super excited about it. Anyways, my favorite game franchise is Horizon by Guerrilla Games. So yeah, you know, I'm super big into anime, games, art, so you know, if you guys want to ever talk about it, just hit me up. I'm always down to chat. A little bit about my art journey. I actually graduated from Laguna College of Art and Design, also known as LCAD, in 2020, so it was, you know, fairly recent. So unlike these ancient relics here.
How dare you?
But yeah, you know, so Diablo 4 is like basically my first commercial game, and you know, such an incredible experience being on the team. I guess a little bit about like the, you know, back history, how I got here. Originally, when I first graduated high school, I actually studied computer science at Purdue University, mostly because my parents wanted me to, you know, coming from an Asian traditional background. But that didn't really work out for me. I was not interested in what I was studying, and eventually got expelled after 1 year. and then came back, talked to my parents about it, and luckily they were supportive about allowing me to kind of pursue my passion in art, because I've always kind of grew up passionate in art, just never really considered it as a career. So that's kind of when I really eventually went to LCAD and kind of started my journey there. But even then, everything wasn't rainbows and unicorn from then on out. It was kind of rough starting out, right? Because I didn't grow up thinking I was going to be an artist. So for the first couple of years at school, like I was kind of at the bottom of my class, I would say. Like I wasn't the best artist in general. And it wasn't until really the third year at LCAD where I kind of discovered my passion for just making games in general. And that's really where my career started to take a turn. And one thing led to another, and eventually I was luckily got picked up by Chaz and sitting here today to talk to y'all. Yeah, so I guess like the reason I kind of brought this all up is like no matter who you are, where you are right now, like maybe you're a student, you're trying to figure out what your path is, you're trying to discover whether or not this is your passion, you're still potentially doubting what you're doing, or you're super enjoying, you're having the best time of your life, or perhaps you're already in the industry, then that's great for you. But regardless of where you are or who you are, like I think what I just want to, I guess like the message I want to give you guys is that like keep pursuing your passion, keep doing what you want to do, keep doing what you love doing, and yeah, one day the fruit's gonna bear, things gonna work out, and yeah, that's all. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Josh.
Cool. Thanks, David. Interesting hearing yourself like this. My name's Josh Anderson, Josh C. Anderson at Blizzard. If you ever email me, it's Josh C. Anderson. There's a lot of Josh Andersons. I'm a senior prop and interactives artist too. I was born and raised here in, well, not in LA, but in Orange County, so it's Southern California. I'm gonna have to load up notes because I'm forgetting already. Yeah, so my background is I was always into anime and video games. I think my first big nerdy experience was watching Akira back as a child and playing Doom. So both way above, like I was probably like 8 years old, so I shouldn't have been watching those things or playing those games, but I did and I loved them. And I think it kind of fed into my career, as you'll see eventually here. Let's see. I was also a terrible student, like David. I did not pay attention in school at all, and I was actually, whenever I had like project or school stuff to do, I'd actually just draw all over the homework instead, so I was not doing very good. I joined Blizzard 12 years ago. I started on what was called Project Titan. Project Titan was the initial conception of Overwatch before it got turned into Overwatch. I can't really tell you more than that. It's actually still NDA. After that, after it got canned, I moved over to StarCraft, where I met Chaz. We worked together on, well, Legacy of the Void. Yeah, I actually did a little stint on Heroes. I made one tentacle. And so then I went over to StarCraft 2 and worked on that for 3 years as Legacy of the Void, released that. When that was done, I shifted over to Diablo IV. I was there from the start. I got there and I was like, oh, Gore, this is what I'm gonna do. Okay, cool. And then, yeah, I've been here ever since. I think that's 6 years now, 12 years total of Blizzard. Good time. Favorite movie and game? My favorite movie is The Thing, and my favorite video game is System Shock 2. Which is, I think, a progenitor of a lot of games you guys play these days, so I always think it's a great one. And actually, I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 at the moment. Great game, also very frustrating because you can't dive in for 30 minutes. You have to play 2 hours at a time. Yeah, and that's it.
Cool.
All right, thank you, panelists. It's weird to say that. I work with these guys every day, yeah, so spoiler alert, Diablo IV is an M-rated game. Hopefully everybody here knows that. We will be featuring a little bit of that gore. Not too much, so if you're squeamish, you should be okay, but just a forewarning. And there will be some spoilers as well. We've got a guy on the team, this guy, who's got some very endgame centric slides, which are really awesome, so look forward to that. But yeah, look forward to some of this. Yeah, this was actually made by Josh C. Anderson, as he was talking about. He's kind of a mastermind when it comes to this this gore, really. and many of it in the game was made by him. And the Props Interactives team, really. Why I include this slide is it's a little bit of a picture of kind of what Interactives does. And as you can see here, you can see the corpses, obviously. You can see the animation. You can see maybe the end result here in the corner of what you would actually see in game, something you click on in Interactive, right? But we did all of it. We did the rigging, we did the animation, we did the modeling, we did the texturing, and we did a lot of the placement or world building as well. You're like, wow, that's a lot. Talking a little bit about kind of that gore, specifically, I wanted to show a couple of slides just about how we use that gore, because we just don't throw it around needlessly. We use it to tell a story. We use it to bring the player through the environment to lead them. And as you can see here, this is right outside of a town in Fracture Peaks. And you can see some corpses, some mud, and a lot of these elements were placed and, like I said, made by Interactives. And we're trying to tell the story of these vampires attacking this town. But it's also our job to move the character through. And on the following slide, you can see we've moved you even closer to the den. The vampire population is getting denser. We place all these corpses along the side here, like they try to climb the walls and got destroyed, ripped apart. And then the gameplay space, you know, it's something we try to make very readable. And definitely a priority of the Interactives team is making sure the game is good to play with the art. So here we have the final scene, more blood and gore, a lot of it again made by Josh. This is the final scene, and you know, down that hall, if you played the game, you know what it probably is, but this is just a kind of a collection of images to show a little bit about how everything kind of comes together. So the modeling, the texturing, the rigging, and the placement in world. And we didn't do everything. The architecture and VFX, of course, we're on a big team, and a lot of extremely talented people helped us make this, but just a little bit of a bigger picture of what Interactives does. Moving on, why Interactives? You know, you might ask yourself, why aren't you just all the props team? Why do you call yourself the Interactives? And in fact, a lot of times when we talk about Interactives, I like to lead with Interactives, even though when you came here today, it said props and Interactives, but Interactives is very special. And I think really a pillar of Team 3, the Diablo team. And it goes really with what we had just seen. All those different features. We're the generalist group in a big group of people, and a big group of people who specialize in making art and design. So, and often Interactives, we play this part of being the connective tissue between a lot of different complex systems and a lot of different people and specialities and disciplines. So we'll go and we'll work with design, and we'll work with other art departments, character art. We'll work with everybody to achieve the results. And this has given us a special position in a big team as being kind of a group that knows how to do a little bit of everything. We may not be the very best, although I think Josh maybe takes the credit for maybe the best score in the game, and Luciano's right there with him, so is David. But we do know a little bit of everything, and I think that's very unique inside of a big game company, big team, a group of generalists who can really get the job done at any stage of development. And that's really key. We're effective in pre-production and post-production and everything in between. We're there, we can fix the bugs, we can rig things up, we can tell a story, model, the whole gambit, really. So we're going to be talking about multiple segments, and just broadly speaking, we're going to be talking about asset creation, And here we have some props actually made by myself. And these were in Skosglen. And some of the first props I made actually on the project. Here, yeah, again, we modeled and rigged these up. These are all destructible, so the player can interact with, again, going back to the interactives portion of our name. And eventually, one of our artists, Michael Che, he did this kind of cool grass look over it so that we could put it in the open world in this forest. So modularity and versatility is a big thing on interactives as well. And Luciano will be talking more about about specifics around asset creation. Dynamics. So that interactive portion, that breakable portion, interactives and dynamics is a big portion. It's how the player connects to the world of Diablo, and it's so important, and I think is missed in a lot of games today. But being able to stop for a moment from killing monsters, even though that's our favorite thing to do, it's my favorite thing to do, but just to stop a moment and to look at the vista, to look at all the storytelling, but also to click on that chest, to click on that rock, and to see what you get. It's a moment to stop from running and killing, and just a moment to kind of breathe, I would say. So dynamics is a big portion of that. It's also our opportunity on the interactives team to steal away a little bit of the thunder of the character team. And if your character team, if you're listening right now, we love you. But it is our moment to be like, hey, you know, you made these awesome monsters, you made these awesome characters, but for a moment, we want you to kill this objective, this giant, for instance, mural here that plays out in the Sightless Eye near the end of the campaign. And this is a cool scene that we put together along with VFX. And we made it explode. It looks awesome. A lot of different departments kind of handled this, but interactives really saw it through. As well as this door, this hell door that erupts and explodes. Again, setting up, placement, all done by interactives. So it's a really special thing, dynamics. Again, it's how we speak to the player. Okay, and that will be talked about by David. David will be talking to you about dynamics. Moving on to world building. World building, you know, the last step really, but probably the most important step. As previously stated, a lot of our core pillars revolve around gameplay space, about moving the player through the environment, about having them go to the places we want them to go to, about allowing them and giving them places to explore. And here we have a really awesome town that we placed a lot of the props for, and we did a lot of this storytelling with the graves, and this was done in conjunction with the amazing environment team to build all of this, but this is the end result, and I couldn't be happier with it. And it tells a lot, I think, about the culture of Diablo, the dreariness, the darkness, the brutality of the world of Diablo. And hopefully that comes through there in a little bit. But also, we deal with scale. And that is a big thing for interactives. It's another core pillar of the team is scale. And you're like, oh, you know, Chaz, why are you showing me this? I want to bring attention to all the small potions, all of the tools, on everything here that's really not floors, walls, and ceilings. That's stuff that we added to this scene. And I hope you all agree that it makes the scene feel lived in. It makes it feel Diablo. It makes it feel grounded and interesting. You kind of want to know what's going on here. So Josh Anderson will be talking a little bit more about that. All right, and finally, from me, as just a note about the interactives team and what we do, is a focus on generality, making a lot of different things, knowing a lot of different things, getting involved, being proactive. These are all very important things on a big project. And it's important, I think, as developers and as aspiring developers, that we all consider this when we get into the industry. We consider our impact to the overall project, not just to a small portion. It's my belief, my personal opinion, that I think the more narrowly that we specialize, the more that we outsource, the more that we lose as a developer. That knowledge base shrinks. So I want you all to really think about that once you get in your career, or if you're already in a career and you have a job, think about how you can expand out, how you can take on more, and I think that'll make you more valuable and bring you so much power in your career. So with all that said, I'm going to be passing this on to Luciano. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chaz. I'm going to talk about asset creation like I just stated. So in this image, spoiler alert, this is towards the end of the campaign. You see obviously hell. It's not a Diablo game without going to hell. You see something obviously happened here. Interactives had like a big hand in describing what happened. After one of our big cinematics, we see the Cathedral of Light army being totally obliterated by the demon army led by Lilith. You can see props are instrumental entering the story here because all the knights' bodies are like dismembered, impaled, they just scatter around. And they're slowly dissolving into the hellish ecosystem, as you can see. The blood is like flowing towards the center and slowly descending towards Lilith Lair, which is really at the end of that bridge. And you can see all the barricades are broken, their army is broken, and their faith is ruined as well. But how do we get here? How do we get to a scene so complex? So we do what we call interactive kit, like culture kits. In this case, we made a hell-specific kit, and we use all kinds of shapes to define first, like what's most iconic. In this case, it was the banners and the light sources, as you can see, and some generic breakable. But we have other types of interactives, what we call like core interactives, which are not manually placed, but instead they are spawned randomly every time you load the game. They're going to be in a different position, or they're going to be different. And we have chests, we have weapon armor racks, we can have these tall malformed souls. They kind of like a fun clicky that you can click on, and they do like a very gruesome animation, and they just give you some loot. Let's break it down to what the fundamentals are to making something like this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these core concepts that are very important in our team. You see, everything starts with the silhouette, really, because it describes what the object is and the relationship it has with its space. Game camera is very important because it's our final output and what the game is about. And it's kind of like putting on a special pair of glasses you need to use to judge your work. Shape language and design is very important as well, especially for interactives, because we can describe the functionality of an object and what it's going to do even before you click on it. We can inform the player with using shape language and design. So talking a little bit about the silhouette in our game, you can see we have the light sources on top and the banners on the bottom. And we judge our silhouettes from all kind of from all angles, basically. You see, via shape language, we describe different assets that share something in common. You can see all the lights, they kind of have like a crystal formation in some parts, and they kind of follow this kind of like bent curve, just growing from the ground, basically. And the banners instead, they have very different language. They have a lot of negative space and a lot of spikes. So each are distinct. So when you see one banner and you see the next banner, you know, oh, I'm looking at the banner immediately, even before you realize what's going on. So talking a little bit about game camera, this is an example of some of the L props placed in an environment. And you can see how versatile one of our kit can be. we build all of these composition arrangements so they can work from multiple angles. You see on the bottom, you see one of our chests, the common chest for the L kit. And you see how different it is looked from straight on, from instead of gain camera. Gain camera tends to compress and squash all the shapes. So we kind of have to account for that. And in this case, for example, we rotated the skull up, we stretched the spikes, and make sure that everything worked from gain camera. And there are rules. We bend a lot the rules within reason. We don't want to break too much, but we certainly do that all the time. So what does it mean, like building an asset from gain camera perspective? In this image, you can see from the left to the right what is the process from a very simple block out in Maya, analyzing what the silhouette are, to the final asset, and finally, like the functionality bit, right? You click on something, how does it change? How does it look after you click on it? So on the top, with the common chest, something that was clearly missing was the rounded top that all kind of chests have in a Diablo game. So that brings back to the topic of shape language. So to add that, we added shape. We added this kind of monster on top, posed in a very painful way, screaming up at you. But the same thing is true on the example at the bottom, the rare chest, where to achieve the same result, we carved out some of the shape, and by doing that, we created all these kind of lines towards the center that focus your attention even more towards where the loot is, where all the action is going to happen. Cool, let's talk a little bit about modularity and variation. And saving time in general is a big thing in a production like Diablo IV. In this image, you can see the drunk culture kit props, like laid out. These are just an example. There are many more. This is just like an example of a few of them. And Sanctuary is a vast place. We want to obviously reuse as much as possible when we make a culture kit. In this example, let's take these two statues on the left and the right and see how we can build these assets in a way that we can reuse like a ton of it and just make our work easier and at the same time make a beautiful game. So most of the time we approach any kind of kit work with the mentality of I'm going to reuse everything I can, So it's not really working on one asset. Oh, I'm working on one statue. No, I'm working on multiple statues at the same time with the same asset. For example, in this case, we can add, remove, or reposition all the components, or mirror the components to just have variation. Or in this other example, we can recompose even after the fact, just to add more versatility to the kit, right? Another example here is like this process begins really early on. We split up the model, we choose which components can be reused in some shape or form, or can they also be used independently? Like you can use only the head, the broken head, or the chest of a statue and it still works. So we can approach these parts as their own assets, really. Another way we make variation is via texture looks. This is like the simplest way to make looks. In this case, I made a variant for the L kit that was specifically requested for a very small portion of the campaign for Lilith's Lair, where all the blood that was dried up, the emissive wasn't there. It was very, to communicate a very ashy and very dry feeling of all the blood was sucked away from evil. So we did that, and it was very fast to do. Another way we need to make variation, sometimes we need a lot of variation within the same culture. In this example, you see some furniture from the human kit for Scotland, one of our region in the game. You can see it's not just a texture look. We just arrange everything in a different way. We add more elements like ivy for overgrown. Everything is kind of like asymmetric and tilted, just to communicate more that idea of overgrown. Or we can have burned arrangements where everything is kind of desaturated and very broken apart and parts are missing, that also to communicate, to tell us the story, right? So a little bit more about the thought process about asset creation. When modeling really anything in our game, and this example is the rare chest for L, we respect a very specific hierarchy. I think of this like a pyramid, where at the bottom you have your basic shapes, and your proportion, those very important things, and you have various steps, and at the very end you have details, right? And the thing about this is that you cannot, every time you go up one step of the pyramid, the step becomes smaller. So detail can never exist before all the other shapes, and they can never be bigger. They can never steal more attention of what they should do. Otherwise, everything becomes confusing. In these other slides, this is the kind of the process we went through when making this chest. Started from the base, really, and worked my way to the lead, and adding more elements, or the fleshy bits, or the skulls. We made brushes with screaming skulls. We made tileable skulls for flayed skin in order to save a bunch of time, because we knew the kit was all about that, and we just made a brush. And when thinking about modeling, what we really can do is thinking about light and shadows, right? Try not to overcomplicate our lives, just try to keep it simple, and thinking about, in an abstract way, like if I blur this image, what I'm really looking at are lights and shadows, right? And where planes are facing camera or are facing away from camera. Are they in light or are they in shadow? And also, like, testing things with different lighting condition helps you validate your shape and form so they can work from every angle. Yeah, that's cool, but how does it look in production, you might say, right? So this statue, for instance, you can see from the left to the right the entire process. We started from a rough block out, then we went through the light and shadow step, then we locked the shapes, and that's the final asset on the right with all the details, right? What's important about the idea stage is that you have to communicate what's happening, what it's all about, what's the action. And once we do that and it's approved, you need to consider where you need to consolidate your proportions and start to think about where the light and shadows are. And if these assets are lit in exactly the same way, if you look from the second image to the last, our lights and shadows doesn't really change that much. We are just adding more detail on top. Then comes the shape lock. And shape lock is like where everything is there. All the shapes are, even the tertiary shapes, are all consolidated. And if you kind of zoom far away and blur the image, the asset is basically done. All we need here is just the final touches and some details to communicate what kind of material it is, right? So speaking a little bit more about details, you can see in this image the model before and after the detail pass. In this case, obviously, it was a statue, so we had like a lot of fun making all the cracks and beating up all the surfaces. But and there are very few brushes that I used, but it's all fairly regular stuff. The only thing I would say here that is important is when making details, we shouldn't really cover the entirety of the model with it. Otherwise, it becomes like a carpet of noise and you don't really see anything more than detail. So the way we approach that is once you do like a detail, the area right next to it should be kind of like free, so for your eye can rest. And at the same time, by doing that, you accentuate the detail you just did, and you give it more importance. Obviously, we didn't do manually all the cracks. We have brushes. Like in this example, you see I'm layering up some brushes just to make the work faster. We make brushes. We have alpha library. They're very useful. They're an integral part of our work. And then you have the final sculpt, right? We judge everything. We render this in Maya with Arnold. This is the goddess statue from the drum kit. And this is the champion version. with the different arrangements of pose. That's cool, but now that we have all of these detail, we want obviously transfer all of these in the game. So it's very important that we do that, otherwise we just wasted our time making all those details, right? So when we start thinking about texturing, what we really do is just analyzing the object and defining what material is made of and which atomic material makes sense for the asset to have. In this case, the drown culture, these monsters, they all live along the coast of Sanctuary, and the whole deal is that they just fish out these things from the sea, and even the statues, and just corrupt them and make them like religious altars of some kind. So it makes sense that it's not just stone, it makes sense there are like algae from the sea, or lichens and dirt, or even sand. So all of these make sense, so we added all of this material on top. And here you can see the different texture breakdowns and how much of the asset was covered with it, with the mask. And on the bottom left, you can see the height maps were used to help with the blending, and the reference maps specifically for each channel, which are very important because they kind of give like the different look. So each material has its own roughness, and it gives a very complex look when you look at it. It's not just stone. It's just like whole kinds of information are in there. And all of this is made possible by amazing material artists, which made like a great material library, and it makes our job much easier. I think 70% of our job is done just because we already have all of those, and what we do, we generate kind of complex mask to blend all of these elements together. So once everything is said and done, the asset is finished, it's fully textured, and the cool thing about this, that we spend the time to make the material just right, and now we can just package this and use on all the statues we're gonna want to make possibly in the future for this kit. And if we fast forward a little bit, we have the entire kit is done, and we just make a little diorama, make sure it works in the biome it should go, and if all the shapes work, and if it's approved, now it's time to make everything interactive, and I'm gonna pass it to David, which is gonna explain everything about that. Thank you.
Oh, that's fine. Cool. Thank you, Luciano, for the awesome asset creation breakdown. That was a lot of really cool art. But don't worry, we got more. So let's talk a little bit about dynamics. All right, so a little bit of overview about what interactives do and why we do certain things. We really work a lot from larger scale things like large statues that Luciano just showed, to even down to the smaller pots, right? So the purpose of this is to kind of really add that difference in scale, to help help the game feel more grounded and relatable by the players, right? Obviously with that, we also add a lot to the storytelling element, right? So for example, wrong button, I thought I had a pointer. But in the example of storytelling here, you'll see that there's like a deer kind of placed on this altar, right, the sacrificial altar. So as a player, when you walk past, you kind of think to yourself, oh, what's going on here? Like, let me check that place out, right? So that's kind of the power of storytelling that we add to the world of Sanctuary. Obviously with dynamics, breakable stuff, we also add to the power fantasy for the players, right? So they feel good, going around smacking pots and crates and fences, just breaking stuff. It just makes them feel powerful, right? And last but not least, we have the interactive world, which is, kind of like allowing the player to feel like they're living in this constantly evolving world that they, as the players, have the power to change, right? So with all that said, like, how do we support, all that we do as interactives? We kind of, right here, I'm breaking it down to like more 4 main categories. First off, we have the culture kit, which is kind of what Luciano just talked about, right? With the drowned culture kit with all the big statues and stuff. So that's related to a specific monster culture, right? So we also have villager culture kits, for example, that could exist in towns, right? Then the second category, we have what we call the core interactives. And what these are really, they're just kind of like lootable items. So they could be chests or, weapon racks or little things that you click on that flips over and gives you a little bit of loot. We also a lot of times use these core interactives to kind of set dress the combat areas, things that needs to be broken and breakable. The third category we have multi-stage, which is kind of like a more complex version of a destructible where, usually we use these as gameplay objectives. And so like instead of breaking in one hit, like all of the kind of regular destructibles do, multi-stage basically, obviously like the name suggested, it breaks in multiple stages as you kind of destroy it. And last but not least, we have the animated sequences, which usually are used for like, story beat or campaign, supporting campaign, or sometimes gameplay, specific gameplay purposes. And I'm gonna, go over all of these 4 categories right up here. First of all, let's go over culture kits. So what really is culture kit, and what does it mean? So what you see on screen right here, this is what we call a toy box. You might have heard the term a asset gym, perhaps. Essentially, it's a flat, test world where we put all of the assets that we've created as, the interactive team in a world where, the designers and the world builders can come in and then fetch objects from, or assets from, if they want to, use them in the open world or wherever. It's also kind of just like an organization thing, so we kind of get to see all of the work that we've done for a particular culture. Because these are associated with each culture, we have, more than dozens of these culture kits in our game. So on the screen here, let's go over a little bit of example of what these culture kits do. Right, so this is one of the camps that I worked on called Malnock. It's one of the strongholds in the game where, originally when you first get there, there's like these monsters kind of infested the area. But once you clear out the camp, it becomes, the villagers move in and now becomes a town that you can go and trade and stuff. So this is after you've flipped the camp. So the villagers are in now, right? So you can see on the screen here, like we have this, this house that has got some like shelves and like armor weapon racks in there, and there's some guard camped outside. And so like, what would you think, is part of the interactive's contribution here? And circled in white is basically all of the stuff that we've added to it, right? So all the shelves from, like I said, like the rugs even, some of the barricades, the campfire, that's all the stuff that we made on our team and then hand-placed, world build into this place. And, without it, if we take all of the props out, this kind of just feels like a purposeless house, right? It doesn't really give a sense of purpose anymore, right? So as a player, if you walk past this, it's not really going to intrigue you to want to go in and like look at it, right? Here's another example of within the same camp, Malnock. This is kind of in the more like the center of the town area, where you kind of see a lot of storytelling element coming in, right? So we got these cool tents set up, we got these like vendors set up as well, and there's like wagons of kind of scooped up, frozen dead bodies in there. Like, so if you had to guess, what do you think would be part of our interactive team's contribution in this screenshot specifically? And if your answer was all the above, then you'd be correct. So again, from the big tents, all the small stools, and even the little campfire and all that stuff, like that's part of our contribution. And obviously, again, without it, it just kind of feels like a really bland, purposeless space that doesn't really intrigue the player anymore, right? So that's kind of what we do with our culture kits and the power that comes in with interactives. So the second category, we have the core interactives. And what are the core interactives? So on the screen here, these are some of the examples of what we call the core interactives. Right here, what you're seeing here is what we call the clickies. You kind of click on them to give you a little bit of loot. Coming up here, we have the weapon and the armor rack, which obviously gives you weapon and armor. And then everyone's favorite, the chests. And then soon right here, we have kind of the regular destroyables. Some drops loot and some don't. So these are basically kind of the core culture kit that we do make for multiple different cultures. And with that said, like how do we approach making these culture kits, right? So kind of like Luciano had already explained, like we really emphasize on modularity, right? So for example, I'm going to use one of the most common assets you probably see in a video game, which is a barrel, right, as an example. So instead of modeling this barrel as like one continuous mesh, which some of you like maybe that's how you're a lot of times taught in school because it's technically the most optimized way to make a barrel, right? We actually instead make it with modular pieces, and so color-coded, each color is a unique piece, right? The reason being is because, the same texture, same barrel right here, we can reassemble these pieces very easily, very quickly to create a ton of very different variations, right? And another reason also is because it helps us kind of break it down when it comes to doing the destructive pass. So with that said, like how do we turn this static barrel from its current state into something that we can now destroy in the game? First off, we take the mesh that we have just created earlier that you saw, and this is, I'm using one of the barrel planks as an example. We basically would first start by bringing it into Houdini. We have an internal tool that helps us kind of apply a certain fracture. So based on the material type, if it's a wood type of texture, that's, you're gonna, what you see on the screen, this is like a wood kind of type of fracturing. We also do stone and stuff. But essentially, it helps us really procedurally quickly cut up the meshes into like little splinters and, pieces. And from there on out, once it's cut up, we bring it into Maya, back into Maya, and then we kind of reassemble it together. So what we do here, what you see on the screen here, basically what's happening is that we're placing a joint in the center of each of these fractured pieces, and then we're kind of parenting these joints in a specific hierarchy, where it kind of gives off the illusion, as you're pulling the joints apart, you can kind of see on the screen right here, it gives the illusion of the pieces kind of falling apart of each other. So like you can kind of see where we're going here with the destructive assets. When that's all done, once we put the joints in a certain hierarchy and stuff, we put it, that's when we import it into our custom game engine called Axe. And circled in yellow is like a couple different types of what we call constraints that we can apply between two joints that are parented to each other. So you can see there's like breakable, cone constraints, all these other names. The most common one that I'm going to go over here is the breakable constraints, which basically in the engine is doing whenever there's two joints kind of parented to each other, whenever there's a force that's impacting these hierarchy, there's a chance that these two joints could fall off from each other. So that's really what the breakable constraints are doing. And in a little bit, I'm going to go over an example of what a cone constraint does as well. But up here, this is the same barrel that we saw earlier, brought into the engine with all the joints hierarchy hooked up and applied with breakable constraints. So as you can see, like every time you hit the barrel, it kind of simulates a little bit differently, right? Sometimes you see bigger chunks of pieces falling off. In this case, sometimes you see like, bigger chunk pieces hits the floor and breaks into even smaller chunks. So you kind of get that secondary impact, right? Secondary motion. As it falls apart, it hits something and it falls apart more. And without the constraints, as illustrated here in this slide, everything just kind of instantly breaks all into one, a bunch of pieces, right? So it just kind of we're losing on that secondary motion. And, to talk about a little bit about different type of what we call a cone constraint here. Essentially, cone constraint, what it's doing is the same thing where it's setting up wise, we're still parenting the joints in a certain hierarchy, but essentially we're ragdolling it, right? So whenever we say, oh, this asset is attacked and broken, we now activate the ragdoll. So instead of these two joints breaking off of each other, they're just doing like a swing motion off of one another, right? So this kind of creates the illusion of, bodies swinging, like the organic kind of feeling. Cool, now that we've gone over the core interactives, let's talk a little bit about the multi-stage, right? So remember, what is a multi-stage? A multi-stage is basically again, a more complex version of a destructible where as you attack it, it kind of starts falling apart, right? It even has an HP bar that you can actually see in game. And as the HP drops, you see visually, like the visuals of this asset is changing. And sometimes we pair that with cool effects as it breaks apart, like you see on the screen here. This asset is actually made by Josh, super cool asset. So since we usually use multi-stage as kind of sort of an objectives pieces, so we need it to really visually stand out. We need it to be very clear to the players that this is something I want to, as soon as I see it, I will probably want to go investigate. I probably want to go click on it or destroy it, right? So visually, what do we strive for, right? So first and foremost, we strive for a very strong silhouette. Kind of like Luciano mentioned, right? When we create our asset, the very first thing we think about is always silhouette, right? Sometimes we also mix in joint and vertex animation. Kind of like in the middle here, you see this succubus that Josh also made. It's doing this like stretching animation, right? So as a player, if you walk past this asset, you're gonna be tempted to investigate it. You're gonna be tempted to go look at it, at least check it out, right? And last but not least, we also sometimes mix in a little bit fancier VFX or lighting. So on the screen, this example is from season 1. This is what we call a malignant heart. Essentially you're seeing this like glowy, flashy bulb, right? Or fleshy bulb. So in the game, as a player, you see this, you're going to want to kind of look at it, right, and click on it perhaps. And just to really quickly explain the difference between joint-based animation versus vertex-based animation. Joint-based animation is basically just the traditional animation method where you'd have like put a joint in a character and then you skin each vertex of the joint and kind of move the joints. But vertex animation is a bit different fundamentally. It's basically driven by shaders. So like it's not really joint-based anymore. It's all basically math. And as an example, if you look closely on the malignant heart on the far left here, sorry, far right, my left, but you're right. if you look at the tendrils, they kind of actually pulsates as time progresses. So that's an example of vertex animation, right? It's driven by shader. So the vertex kind of like, like expands and then contract over time. So again, just to reiterate, with multi-stage, we often use it to support objectives, right? So in this case, this is one of the local events that we have in the game. And as you can see, as a player, as you're walking into this local event, it's very clear to you that whatever that is in the center that's being channeled upon, that's probably something you want to go investigate or perhaps even destroy as a player. A couple other usage for multi-stage. Sometimes we also use it as destroyable blockers. So this is also back in the camp Melnock that I mentioned earlier at the beginning of my section. In this case, we're using it as a destroyable blocker where once you destroy it, it unlocks a traversal where you can now slide down and get to a different section of the map. And last but not least, sometimes we also use multi-stage assets to support more of your unique gameplay beat, right? So for example, for this example, we have this pillar that's like being destroyed as you attack it, and at the final stage, instead of just kind of exploding, it actually falls over and then becomes a traversable bridge that now player can take to traverse to another section of the map. So it's kind of the opposite of what you just saw with the the destroyable blocker. So instead of unblocking a path, it's actually unlocking a new path for you. Cool. So last but not least, we have the animated sequences that we do on Interactive Steam, and usually with animated sequences, they're just a little bit like longer animation timeline. They're usually bespokely animated, and sometimes got fancier VFX, right? So as you can see on the screen here, we have the bridge coming out from the sand, forming this new traversal path that now the player can travel across. And a lot of times with these kind of complex animated sequences, they're used to also support unique story beats that can come with campaign moments, for example, right? So on the screen here, this is earlier in the campaign when you first meet Vigo and Nyrel. You were tasked to go under this like mining outpost, and then eventually you come across this elevator that's stuck, right? And so like as a player, you go and click on it and to unstuck the elevator, right? So a lot of times with these animated sequences, what we're doing is we're kind of addressing a certain story beat that designers want us to address, but at the same time we're problem solving, right? So in this case, we're solving the problem of the elevator needing to have two states visually, right? The first state being it visually allowing the players to understand that it's not an elevator that they can use right now, right? It's something that it is not accessible. And then the second state, we have to communicate that once you've unjammed this elevator, then it is now accessible to the player, and you can use it to traverse to another section, right? So that's why we kind of had the elevator hanging midair at first. So it's very clear to the player that's not something they can walk onto, right? Cool. Sometimes we also use these kind of more animated sequences to support a very specific gameplay purpose. So for example, on the screen here, this is also from Season 1. This is what we call the malignant capturing sequence. Essentially what's happening here is, in Season 1, there's like these special unique type of monsters called malignant monsters, where once defeated, they're going to drop a corpse pile, which is going to kind of, like on the screen here you'll see, kind of forms into this malignant heart, right? And while the malignant heart's there, player can then go to interact with it, click on it, which is going to initiate the sequence, a part of the sequence you just saw right there, where it kind of like does this morphing animation, goes down into a cage, and then like kind of sinks into the ground, and then from there, a tier 2 malignant monster is going to form. I'm going to revisit part of this asset in a little bit, so keep this in mind, but let's talk about a little bit something else first. So a little bit about, I guess, like the overall kind of the loop of what we aim for with unique assets like multi-stage and animated sequence. A lot of times we're aiming for this feedback, anticipation, and then reward loop. So kind of in like the principles of animation, right? So feedback in this case, on the screen here, this is one of the multi-stage assets I made, where as you attack, you're going to see this hit flash, right? The bright blue kind of flashing goes off. That's really part of the feedback that we're addressing, right? And sometimes you see that as you attack it, as you whack it, like it's like doing this twitching animation as if it's in pain, right? That's also the feedback. So as the player, as you're attacking this objective, you're getting that initial very quick feedback that, oh, something's happening, that you're doing something correctly, right? And then the anticipation really comes in right about, it's going to come up in a second, right here, where you kind of see that now that you've attacked it, it feels like it's about to do something, right? You see the kind of the bulb kind of like sucks in a little bit, and the embryo inside kind of starts twitching a little bit more, looking like it's in pain. That's the anticipation part. You're expecting something to come up, but you don't know quite sure what to expect yet. last but not least, we have the reward, which is what you just see right here. This is a reward, right? So the visual reward of like satisfaction, explosion parts, right? That feels good to just do it. And you're like, oh, I want to do that again. It feels great, right? Or sometimes it could be the form of gameplay reward, right? So it drops loot, perhaps. Or, auditorial reward, right? It's play some really satisfying sound effects. So that's all part of the feedback, anticipation, and reward loop that we aim for. Here's another example for the same feedback, anticipation, reward loop, but this time on a more uniquely animated sequence. So this is also an asset made for season 1, where it's kind of like a Pokemon selection kind of thing, where there's 2 colors, colored smaller orbs that kind of links into the bigger center orb, and whichever color you choose, it kind of turns the bigger orb into that color and then spawns the corresponding monster. And so yeah, let's quickly break down this specific asset real quick. How do we achieve this effect? So first off, on the left here, you'll see that I've created kind of this center mesh first, right? Where it's pretty simple. It just has a initial idle state where it's just there, and then it has this animation where it kind of plays a little bit of, it sucks in on itself a little bit, and then the emissive starts coming out. You start seeing it light up, and then it explodes. Or actually, in this case, it just kind of hides itself, right? At the last frame of the animation, it kind of just disappears, right? Then we combine that with what we call a client effect, which is kind of just like usually we spawn in something really quickly, like that just explodes, right? So which is what you see in the center of the screen here. You see these like explosive parts, along with a little bit of misty VFX to kind of cover up the transition, right? So when you put the 2 and 2 together, it kind of gives the illusion of this center orb kind of doing its a little bit of animation and then exploding, right? And from there on out, we basically pair that first asset you just saw on the left here with a smaller orb that you see right here on the right. It basically, the smaller orb, really what it's doing is as soon as it's clicked on, it plays kind of this morphing animation and kind of dissolves towards the center of where the main mesh would have been, right? So when you put 2 and 2 together, it's really just kit bashing at this point, right? I already created these as separate assets. Now I'm just kit bashing it to form one cohesive asset before I hand it off to the designer, right? And so this is kind of circling back to what Luciano was also saying about modularity, right? It's as you can see, we're not building this asset as one unique continuous mesh. We're building it as multiple different compartments. And this really allows us to be more flexible, iterative, right? So if, for example, if the designer was to come here and say, hey, actually, instead of 2 colored orbs is hooking into the main center orb, I want 3 or 4 even, perhaps, right? Then for me, that's a very easy change, right? I don't have to remake the whole mesh, retexture everything. I just kit bash them together. And again, just to replay the result, this is essentially what comes out of it, right? After all this work, and if you look closely a little bit, whichever colored orb that doesn't get selected actually kind of plays this more underwhelming dissolving animation where it just kind of fades away. So a lot of that's a little attention to detail kind of thing is what as the interactive team strive for. And yeah, with all that said, let's go over super quickly, the pipeline overview. Game development doesn't really work in bubbles, right? It's a very, very collaborative process. So there's always going to be upstream teams versus downstream team, right? So, and we have to support and account for these upstream and downstream teams. So what does that, kind of upstream, downstream, look like? What does it even mean, right? So here I'm going to use the malignant kind of capturing sequence, at least the first section of it, the forming sequence, as an example. So first, just like any artist would do, we basically create the mesh, the texture, and in this case, we also rig and animate the whole thing. Right? So this is all done in Maya. You can see we have these tendrils coming up from the bottom that kind of goes from kind of thin, and then as it wraps around itself, it kind of thickens up a little bit, right? And you kind of see this on the bottom of the mesh, there's this weird mesh. It kind of does this deform animation upwards, and it kind of just gets stuck there. And that's part of the process when we're creating this. And in the next slide, you'll see that why we do this. So once all that's done, we put it into Axe, our engine, and this is where we kind of start applying the materials transition, right? So in this case, you'll see that the bottom mesh, as it kind of animates upward, it actually dissolves away at the same time, right? Kind of giving that illusion of this mesh, whatever corpse pal it is on the bottom, it's kind of transferring its mass into this orb that you see that forms. Right? So kind of like the Venom effect, from Spider-Man. And from there on out, sometimes, depending on the case, we apply lighting, right? So for example, for this example, we kind of see this like bright orange light that kind of slowly lerps in, like slowly increase in intensity as the heart kind of forms upon itself. And usually by this stage, it's like pretty set to go for on our end. And this is where we will potentially say, hey, let me just hand this to the downstream teams. So for example, this is where we would hand off to VFX to apply the rest, right? So VFX is coming in and applying that decal on the bottom that kind of sucks in, and then obviously the kind of fiery, embering kind of idle effect that they added in as well. And it's also important to note that we don't always just only pass our asset downstream to the VFX or audio team. We also pass it back upstream to designers who handed off the block out asset potentially to us in the first place, right? So this is when, for example, in this asset, I would hand it back to the designer and say, hey, like I think this asset's about ready to go. All the sequence is set up for you to use. So all you gotta do as a designer is, figure out when or where to spawn it, and that's pretty much it, Cool. So that about sums up the dynamic asset portion of our talk for the interactives. So now that we've talked about how to create static assets that Luciano went over, and talked about how to create more dynamic assets that you just saw. What do we do with these assets that we created? And I'm going to have Josh to talk to you about everything that comes next.
Cool. Thank you, David. I'm actually going to rotate this a little bit.
That's smart.
Because I like this screen better. Test this laser pointer. Cool. All right. So, world building. This is pretty obvious what world building is, but let's just go over it. With Luciano, we built the asset. With David, we set it up. Now we're going to the world building. Interactives actually has a pretty large purview in world building. We're almost there everywhere in the world, placing things, making sure stuff is set up and working. Everywhere. So let's go over it. I made this kind of pipeline chart thing, and it is complex. Basically, the only thing you really need to take out of this is that we work with a lot of different departments. There's a lot of cross-team integration and a lot of blah, 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 blah. But what it comes down to is there's high-level decisions from narrative and design. They say, hey, like we need a place. Interactives is okay. And we work with everyone, interactives, environment, production, design, VFX, and we make Diablo IV. Okay, so this is a high-level view of the world-building area test that we do. I'm just going to read them and then move on to the slides specifically because there's details. The campaign priority areas, this is golden path. Again, I'll describe when I get into it. Campaign events, dungeon campaign, objective areas, cities, hubs, camp strongholds, side missions, spawning events, local events, parentheses, wilderness, and dungeon. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of stuff there. This is the first, and I put in the corner here the type of priority that we're looking at for each thing. But this is the big thing. This is the golden path. This is the campaign priority areas. This is, if we're building Disneyland, this is Disneyland, and everything inside of it is the theme park rides. So this area I am showing is Yslina, which is part of the, one of the main campaign areas. You come down here from Fracture Peaks into Yslina, and it's a hub. There's everything. There's a lot of story beats here. There's a lot of important campaign events. If you go in this direction, you'll run into the first interaction with Nyrel and Vigo, where you go into the mines to find one of the ancient tombs of Lilith, and then over here's the Roderick Vault, which is where you help Nyrel and meet, spoilers, Wolfisto. Yeah, and this is, it's considered high priority because everybody is going to go through this. Every little detail in these areas needs to be pretty succinct and smartly done because everybody's going to see it, so it's high priority. This is a campaign events area. This is the little, like I said, it's Disneyland. This is the theme park ride, right? So this is considered high priority because every single beat in this is important and integral to the story. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of complexity involved. But this I'm showing is the volcano area in Dry Steppes, and it is one of many shrines to the three primeval. This one is Mephisto. When you click on this altar here, you go into a sort of like spirit realm area where you fight demons and do stuff. For Mephisto, and you get to blessing. You have to do the same thing with Baal and Diablo. It's just one of many areas. But it's important. And this is the same thing, but basically in dungeons. So again, we have purview of stuff in dungeons, not just open world. David, probably hard to see, but he already showed this where there's like an elevator going down, and there's this door on the right here, which is something that Chaz worked on. I'm showing them because we need to facilitate the complexity of these things, to do story beats, to show cool moments. This door is giant, so when it opens up, it's kind of like, oh, cool. Yeah. This is cities, hubs. This one should be obvious. I mean, people spend hours and hours, potentially years in these cities, and so they need to be performant, they need to look good. There's a lot of areas you can go to. As you can see, there's a vendor here, there's the waypoint, there's another vendor in here. What do you call it? The horse is down there, the wardrobe is up in there. So this is a complex area, there's a lot of different things going on. It needs to look good. But also, I think the one thing I would like to stress with this is that performance is incredibly important in an area like this, because there's going to be so many people here. It is one of the strongest vignettes in the game. Everybody's going to see this. So cities, big priority. Strongholds. So strongholds are areas that you can conquer. Basically, when you first interact with these areas, it'll be basically overrun with bad guys or some sort of other story beat, and you need to kill them or do some sort of adventure of, I don't know, whatever, something. But what happens is we set up a what we call flip states, a pre-flip area, which will be depicted as something before you do something in the area. And then when you conquer the area, it'll change over and turn into a new setup with vendors, and basically it becomes like a little hub that you can use and go and do your missions from that area. But also high priority and complex. Side missions. I'm going to go. There's another slide with this specific side mission and like its description, but. I wanted to point out that side missions, while medium priority, we like to hit every single one of these things up, because I think we're all storytellers and we really want this stuff to look good. And so there's a lot of story beats that are in relation to a side mission, and we need to facilitate the visual storytelling and make sure it's interesting, and that all the beats about that little thing is there. And it's like, there's no jarring weirdness when you get to the area. It like coincides with the side mission that you're basically handed off. All right, local events. These are procedurally generated events, but if you played the game, you've probably run into a dude asking for help underneath a wagon, screaming for help, and then you ignore him and run off, right? We do these things, but as you know, there's multiple variations of these. There's some that are like a spire, where you need to collect blood, and then when you connect to the blood, it'll spawn a bad guy, and you need to kill that guy. There's also like variations of even that, where it's like spiders versus goatmen. And in this example, this is a goatmen. I think this is what I just described, the people hiding underneath the wagon asking for help. This one was set up by David, but there's also spider versions and ghouls and whatever. David did all those. And it's under our purview because it needs to look good. When designers initially set this stuff up, it is incredibly rough. Yeah. All right, wilderness. I mean, while low priority, we actually do passes on the entire continent of Sanctuary, just to make sure that story beats and the flow of the world feels good for players, and there's no like jarring like inconsistencies. This is a place in Kyrgyzstan with a bunch of wagons and debris, and like even though it's it's not like a major storytelling beat. It is still important to us, and like we're interested in making sure that we field all these sort of ideas in a coherent and interesting way. Yeah, and there's a giant fire pit thing. This is dungeon spawning. So this slide might be a little confusing at first, but what is happening is on the left is in a dungeon, you're seeing a bunch of these assets on the right inside the dungeon. And I'll get into this more detail later, but dungeons are procedurally generated, and that includes spawning of assets, and we can use marker sets or we can use themes of ideas. So like a dungeon can have like spiders and vampires, and we have spawning locations, and based upon what fields we put in, it'll swap stuff in from ghouls to spiders, and it has a lot of variation it can pick from. So everything on the right here is something that could have spawned here on the left. And again, I'll get into more detail. All right, so storytelling. Yeah, so I'm not gonna read all this. I'm just gonna tell you them and go to the slide. So storytelling, we do a lot of storytelling. It's like a huge pillar of interactives. I think artists are all really interested in storytelling. When we're doing a video game, it's a large, complex set of moods and interactions and characters, and interactives likes to make sure that all those ideas gel together. And we do that in 4 different ways. Yeah, big and small, the world changes, vignettes, lived in world. There's more ways that we do it too, but like, it's a presentation. All right, so big and small, like the idea behind big and small is that while we will facilitate large visuals, like this is a campaign story event when you arrive in Ghoulron, we're showing, like we did all that, like the gore and a lot of props here and there, like we did all this stuff, right? While this is big, I wanted to point out that even though this is where you were just looking at, everything that happens around here in relation to that event is something that we're also hitting up. So that includes like hitting up waypoints in blue, making sure that pathing is all good around it and there's a clarity because people will be zooming in and out of here, and we don't want them to feel like they're constricted or anything like that. This yellow bubble, their guy is hanging out here, right? Well, like there wasn't anything here until we placed props and just sort of like helped make something happen. And then design eventually added this guy, and he has a little story beat. You can talk to him about how miserable he is, which is pretty typical. This green circle is in the campaign, there's a couple different things that happen. Spoilers, you meet this lady, she gets hurt. You bring her back here and you heal her. Lorath helps you out with our friend. Yeah, and so we need to facilitate this idea. So we like add the tents, we make sure the bed is there. There's places for people to sit down on. Little details, but it's all there and we handle it. The world changes. So this is like a storytelling event. This is like a thing that we want to achieve in the game, which is the idea that you are having impact on the world, right? And one of the ways that we do that is making sure that the world changes as you're progressing through the campaign, through the story. Spoilers, this is Saragar. You release a demon hound. The demon hound blows up Saragar. This is pretty typical. This is Eldheim Keep. When you get there, it is fine and pristine. Eventually, it gets overrun. People die, and I'm showing actually a third state here, which is the idea that when you're done with the game, there's actually states in the game that we're keeping persistent, like this, which is that stuff happened, people died, the area is still messed up. And we wanted to make sure that whenever there's a story beat like that, we make sure it happens, make sure the technology behind it is all working and stuff. So a lot of testing, a lot of people involved actually making this happen. It sounds easy, but it's actually really complex. All right, vignettes. Like this is the side mission that I was talking about, but in a little bit more detail. So for vignettes, in terms of storytelling, it's facilitating a deep, like a really strong narrative in a like compact area. It's like a, you know, it's a shot of narrative. It's really like intense. But this is the brazier that I was talking about, which has to do with this side mission, which is you light it on fire, and the idea is that there's sort of a religious ceremony behind it. When you light it on fire, a bunch of bad guys are swarming in because it's part of like a ritual to bring people into basically like a death trap, right? Well, monsters into a death trap. And we facilitate the religious aspect by, like, we helped, we didn't build the church, but we did, you know, set up some of the religious iconography around it and made sure that it was all there. We have a bunch of like these barricades with spikes, and they're all pointing inwards. So when bad guys flow in, while it might not be like necessarily super loud, it's there. The player can find these storytelling beats, and we want to make sure that it's all in there for them to find. We do that with every storytelling side mission, pretty much. So there's a lot of overview on this stuff. All right, lived in world. So this is the idea that when any sort of thing happens in Sanctuary, that there's a sort of like real impact in the world. Whether it be monsters going through the area or people like defending themselves and setting up forts and barricades or just traversing across the land. So in this picture I actually showed the Drown. What we do with the Drown, like they have this sort of idea of like ships and statues and gunk, and whenever they arrive in the world they bring all their stuff with them. It's part of the culture kits that we were talking about earlier, but we want to make sure that the impact on the world when the monsters arrive or the people or whoever is felt. And all these details, we make sure it all gets in there because it really helps ground the impact of like a material world where things happen and the bad guys are doing stuff, and there's a sense of just like danger just being in the area, and you kind of get like a weird feeling about them because they're disgusting and weird, but also like compelling in a certain way. Same thing here. The cannibals, it's just, you know what you see this stuff, you know it's cannibals. Like, you're in the area. They've been eating people. They've been stringing them up. The cannibals are having a good time. Everybody else isn't, though. Yeah, and I wanted to show this. This is a shot from Hawazar. Well, not necessarily like a big scene here. I just like that we have all these little elements of people living in this area, and boats and some sort of like stick hut tarp where they're hanging hides or whatever. Like, this is stuff that we do too. It's everywhere. We get into every little thing and nook and cranny and make sure that it feels lived in and like people have been there and doing stuff. All right, scene composition. This is another like pillar of world building for interactives, but I'm just gonna read it. Yeah, so we're trying to deliver visual ideas clearly, right? And punctually. Make sure it's like really clear. As soon as you see it, it's like, oh yeah, I know, I get that idea immediately. And we do that in a couple different ways. One is communication, one is visual interest, one is scale, and one is pathability. So communication. This slide, while it's like only 3 seconds long, there's actually a lot of communication going on. It's all there. It might not be like super obvious, and you might not even really care because it's like so like how do I put it? Obvious, I guess, but we do that. Like, we want to make sure that it's not missing, because if it was missing, you would feel it immediately because it's so there, it's smooth. But in this case, there's a theme of defense. We're trying to show this like fortification, right? As you enter Saragar, there's a sense of like people fighting against the elements, against the bad guys invading into the area. And we do that like it's simple, you know, archery towers, making sure there's arrows and people up there. We have barricades in yellow, and you know, reinforcement of the walls with people carving up wood and setting up the pylons and fortifying things. But it's all there. Actually, and this theme of defense, it's kind of up in all these slides, although it relates to communication. But sorry, I'm getting confused. Never mind about that. Okay. Theme of Chiso. Yeah. So this is about actually visual interest. So one thing we do, so this is like a big theory thing about like how to make things visually interesting in video games or art in general. There's a million different ways, but for Diablo, I wanted to talk about like one thing that we typically do because of our game camera. It's very common for us to do, but it's the idea of like leading you down a track into like a big moment. So in this corridor, this is the chief's hut. You start down here, you end up at this thing, but it's a sort of a ramp up, right? It's like the intensity could be like at 1 or 3, and then you get down here and it's 10 or 11, right? Yeah, it's a simple device. It makes visual interest because it's sort of a build-up. It has a cadence. It makes things interesting. Same thing here. If you played Nostrava, you've entered this church where you find this statue and a bunch of cultists worshiping essentially Lilith and succubi. But the idea is that when you get into the church, there's not much initially on the arrival that tells you like this is like a super dangerous place or anything like that, although you get a sense because there's something freaky going on here. And then you get to the end of the hall and there's blood and gore everywhere. Diablo. All right. Scale. So this is just a in Saragar again, and I mean, what's it say? There's a lot of different sort of scale objects in here, but there's an intention with them all. We have like really small things, we have medium things, and we have like a selling point, which is like a central sort of visual hook, which even though it's just an inn, we make sure it feels bubbly and nice to be in here. It should feel welcoming. And all these elements from the beds to the candles, I think even the wardrobe, it lends to that sense that this is a place of rest. Pathing. This is sort of gameplay related, but it is something that we do on our end, which is clear pathing. We don't want people to bump into stuff that they don't see. We make sure that the road is clear, basically. And so I think in this example, I'm just showing that you can walk around towns, and it's pretty smooth, fluid. The design usually is something like this. The flow, vendors from the waypoint. This is Sarah Gargan, yeah. So vendors, blacksmith, or vendors. Smooth. All right, gameplay. So another pillar for world building in terms of interactives. Facilitating gameplay, right? So we work with a lot of different teams to make sure that gameplay first, right? That's a Blizzard sort of tenet. Yeah. So we do this in a couple of different ways, and we do it with clear objectives, we do it with gameplay leads, we do it with gameplay and artification. Sorry if my head's in the way, by the way. Describe those in more detail. Clear objectives. This is sort of, I think, kind of obvious, but like, this is clearly objective, right? And this is something we want to facilitate, because even though we do the artification, all these areas around this thing, and even here, we want to make sure that the thing you actually need to go after and be worried about is very clear. And sort of a central tenet for us is that clearness, visibility, like making sure that it's punctual, right? So I think this is pretty punctual. Same thing here. This is something David set up. This is the blood pustule over in, I forgot the name right now. But even though with all the stuff going on, you can see that this is the objective. So there's a lot of monsters, there's a lot of like stuff here. But we should make sure the thing is always obvious, the thing that you need to deal with. Gameplay lead. So this is about the idea that this GIF is going to be confusing until I explain it, so let me sort of explain here. There was a design put together by design team to make a sort of a moment where you needed to wait like a minute for a bunch of stuff to happen while a bunch of waves of enemies comes and attacks you. So basically, it's drown assets, and what you need to do is you hit this winch, it turns on. This boom takes what feels like an hour to move across, and when it finally hits when it hits its target, you can traverse across it. So gameplay basically had a design, and David had an idea about how to implement it, and he hooked up all the details. There's a bunch of stuff that happens, like when this moves, there's like ropes pulling off and going all over the place. So we work on the details, but gameplay set the design imperative, like the thing that we need to work on, and we make it work. All right, gameplay versus artification. Rather, gameplay first, artification second. So this area of Chaldeum, I like to show this because it's just, there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's a lot of complexity of the scene between the environment art and our stuff, but the pathing is super crispy, clear. The blue and purple here represents clear pathing. The red borders are stuff, if you run into that, that's the edge of the nav. You notice there's nothing in here, like in the middle. All blue, all purple. That means the player will never run into anything unless they try to. But that's something we'd like to facilitate, and I think this is a great example of like, while this area is very artified, it is also like, it is a solid piece of gameplay where we did our thing, they did their thing, and it all worked out. A+. All right, dungeon randomization. Making up new words. Open world versus dungeon spawning. Okay, so there is randomization and like, what do you call it? Procedural spawning in the game. I should have changed this. This shouldn't say dungeon, it should say randomization. Procedural spawning, really. But we facilitate it in open world and dungeons as well. I kind of described it a little bit earlier. There's more in-depth explanation. So dungeon, randomized spawning. These green guys are what we call dungeon spawners, markers. We have specific names for them. This one is called an any, this one is an edge, this is a corner. The metrics is a 1x1, this is a 2x4. This is a 2x2. Even though it has the corner, it's still a 2x2. We use these, basically design and dungeon art places these things, and we help by facilitating what actually spawns into this stuff. But because the area is, we know exactly what things are going to spawn, that we can sort of artify it, so we can make it look good, right? So if you can imagine here, like I described, this green spawner, imagine you're the computer or the engine and it's just like doing a thing. What the engine is doing when I'm simulating here is, it is picking one of these random objects, it is grabbing it and moving it over into this marker thing, the green thing. So while we make all this stuff, and then we know what is potentially going to go into these markers. So we have purview on this stuff because we have a bunch of rules. We understand like what makes this stuff look good. We stick within these metrics really tightly because it gets rid of a lot of like, what do you call it? Like errors and stuff like penetrating to walls. People just know it's going to work when they place the markers. We do that for 1x1s, we do that for 2x2s, and you can see all this stuff. Every single object here potentially can go into the marker thing. Scientific name. All right, open world. I just wanted to share this screen because we do help facilitate open world spawning. All these green things are actually like a spawn marker. And while we don't necessarily feed objects for every single thing here, we do for a lot of them. Like any of these squares, are us. Sometimes this is us, but there's a lot of them. There's a lot of randomization in the game. We need oversight on all the objects that can potentially go into these things. We need to make sure they look good. And we need to make sure they actually fit the area, which is something that we have issues with sometimes. But yeah, control. We try to control that stuff. All right, open world, randomized spawning. So this is, like we were talking about earlier, the local events. This is a local event area in the open world, and it's just right now cycling between different local event potential things that could spawn. When you go into the game, the engine will pick one, and that will be the thing that you see in the game. This is what that circle looks like, the local event spawner. And as you can see here, it is, again, just picking a bunch of stuff from, pillars and random things to tornadoes. So we have a lot of power of stuff that can go into this. And that's it. I'm going to pass it back to Chaz.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, and thank you to the panelists for all your awesome work in setting up this presentation. Little extra nice work. But thank you to everybody who's attended and really coming out and supporting us by just being here and seeing your kind and happy and sometimes frightened faces when you see some of that gore that we were seeing. Yeah, one last thing I wanted to close out with you all before we ended tonight, when we move over to Q&A, is, like I expect a lot of people here are students, and I imagine some of you would like jobs, right? Money's good, you need to eat. That's probably a good idea to get one of those. And I would be remiss if I wouldn't say that it's a good idea, while we just talked about all these awesome generalist things on interactives, all these really cool asset creation and dynamic building and world building and all the amazing things you can do with all the skills that we just showed. It's very important as a student especially that you focus on your craft, that you take it to the utmost pinnacle of your ability, and you really drill in on it and make it the best you possibly can. Because that presentation, that focus is important to impressing an employer. While that is all well and good, and I really want you all to internalize that, remember these things. Remember all the things that we talked about, because once you get your first job, once you introduce yourself into the industry, I think you're going to sing, your career is going to fly if you learn some of these things and you remember some of these lessons taught today, because it's a way you can elevate yourself in your craft. It's a way you can go further and faster than your peers, in a way to make yourself that much more integral to the pipeline, that much more important to the process. So that's my little bit. Thank you very much. We'd like to kick you away then.
Keep it going for the Props and Interactive team from Diablo 4. I'm gonna sit here with y'all as we go through some of these questions before we get out of here. We are doing things a little bit differently today. So if you all have any questions, if you have a cell phone, go ahead and check out our story on Instagram. We're Gnomon_school. There's a link there. You can click on that link and you can put in your question right there. We've already been giving that to the live streams already, so we got some questions already populating if you wanted to go through one of those. But if you have more questions, throw them on in right now, because they're here only for a short time. We tried to convince them to just stay here and leave Blizzard, but they wouldn't do it for some reason. So are we all good all the way straight through? Because I think this one right here is pretty interesting. The number, we're looking at the same thing, by the way. Chaz and I are looking at the same thing. Number 5, if you don't mind, I can ask that to y'all, and y'all can just kind of dive into that one.
Yeah. So the question is, and I'm going to give this to Josh. How do you go about making a trail, village, grove, etc., feel detailed without feeling cluttered? Any references or inspiration?
Sorry, can you say that again?
How do you go about making a trail, village, grove, etc. feel detailed without feeling cluttered? Any references or inspirations?
Oh, I think we do something we call clumping. Scientific term, clumping. But basically, yeah. So basically the idea is if you really want a strong composition, it isn't just throwing stuff all over the place, right? That you want intention, but what looks good is actually something like a lot of like interior decorators will do, or people that work on theme parks and stuff. But it's the idea of like I'll use this chair for example, right? We have the small bottle of the chair, and imagine there's like a pillar or a statue. You have like a small thing, a medium thing, and a big thing. And by clumping those things together, you have like, you can tell a little vignette, like a little story. And it's stronger to do it that way than just having like, if I spawned in 1,000 bottles and threw them on the floor, it wouldn't be that interesting, right? We need to put them in a place and tell a story with that. So like your trail, I'll try to keep it short, but if like your trail, if you want to tell a story, so usually you would have like some sort of idea, like the Diablo way of telling this would be, there's a blood trail with little body parts, and it trickles into the big gore thing, and then maybe something even more horrifying than maybe what you expected, which is just like a dead body, but actually like an abomination or something, or like a ritual, like a cultist ritual, people are being cut apart. It's very Diablo. But the idea is lead people, trickle in the idea, sell them, hit them with really hard, and use the clumping like idea of that to dot it until you get to the big thing.
Cool. I hope that answers your question. Thank you, Josh.
You want to take over for the question so I can leave y'all up here, so I don't want to stomp in. But there was another great question right here, where it was, is all the destruction and effects done in engine? So all of the destruction that y'all do, is it all done in engine? And could you go a little bit on how all of that kind of goes from start to finish?
Yeah, David.
Yeah, of course. Yes, most of our destruction and effects are done directly in the engine. You know, all the physics simulation, you know, with the joints I was talking about, how the forces are applied and how the joints are calculated to break off of each other. We do the initial setup in, you know, 3D program like Maya, for example, where we set up the baseline of it. But once it's imported in the engine, you know, physics side of things kind of take over the calculation part, which is what gives you all that like difference in simulation every time you do break something. There are some unique cases that we do kind of simulation outside of the engine. For example, what we use this thing called VAT, so vertex animated textures. Basically, we would do a simulation in Houdini, for example, and then we would import that whole simulation. We would encode it into a texture file and import it into the engine to play back that same destruction. So depending on the complexity and the use case, most of the time it's done directly in engine. But if it's like for a bigger cinematic moment almost, or like, you know, where there's like more complex pieces that needs to be simulated that is going to impact performance too much, if we try to do it, you know, directly in the game, then that's kind of the time where we would go into, you know, potentially using a Houdini, where we're bringing a pre-simulated asset. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's about kind of controlling the beats, right? And you want that more finer control. And in those cases, like David said, we'd maybe rely a little bit more on Houdini, something that's going to be pre-played out by us artists, rather than the randomization of in-engine assets, which are fun as well.
That's awesome. You all mentioned quite a few times that you're storytellers, right? That's part of what you do. But within that, is there any direct inspiration that you have in your day-to-day when you're working on stuff? So any story that you're looking into, obviously, Jay was mentioning, oh, it's very Diablo, it's very Diablo. But without that direct inspiration, is there anything that you look at like, wow, this cart looks like a cart that I saw in Monty Python. Oh, maybe I'm going to put Monty Python assets. Not saying that you do that, but is there anything like that, any stories or plots that really inspire you throughout your work?
I guess I'll start with that, and then I'll let Luciano take off from there. So I know personally I'm very inspired by you know, medieval Europe. I mean, hopefully you would be working on a Diablo game. But I look at a lot of references. I'm very interested in arms and armor. In fact, we've had classes of master arms and blacksmiths come in and teach courses. But I've always been interested in that stuff. I like how things are made. I like the reasons why armor is shaped and why certain cultures fasten things differently than others, different armor types, and how they built them to distribute impact over whilst it was a sword or a spear or bow and arrow. But I really like the real world inspiration that you can use for something like Diablo, and I kind of get geeked up on that kind of stuff. But Luciano, do you have any more thoughts?
Yeah. So sometimes we look at famous movies and we try to recreate a moment or kind of something similar. But something we do kind of also uniquely, I think, in this game is we look at a lot of the old masters and their composition, how they used like very old methods of making art and just make something cool out of it. We have more than 2,000 years of arts just to look at for free. So we try to do that all the time and just try to incorporate that in our work.
Yeah, that was a great thing Luciano just mentioned, which is the old masters pillar of the Diablo team, and I hope you guys can kind of see that in Diablo 4. See some of that real world reference, those master painters from the past that comes through. I hope.
You were also talking about the procedural generated dungeons and outside world and stuff. Do you see any pitfalls between procedural generation and hand placing elements? Is there anything where you go back and you're like, man, if I hand placed this, it would have been better than putting it in this procedure? Or is it like you all have, because you were talking about that set of rules that you have, are those set of rules so airtight where it's like you don't really fall into that?
It's a great question. Yeah, that's something during the development process, you have to make a decision, right? Do you want to be able to control the narrative? Do you want to be able to lead the player through the environment and lead them through a story? Or do you want more variation? Do you want more randomization? And that's somewhat set in place by design, but also controlled by us. It was actually my decision at a certain point in time, 5 years, 6 years working on a game. I can't remember exactly when it was put into place, but where I had decided basically that I would like to tell the story and lead the player through the environment in the open world, but to leave that randomization, that classic Diablo, randomization, to the dungeons. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, can I? So, I think our game, we tried to, so the design philosophy was to have a really large game with a lot of like stuff, right? But at the end of the day, like we built a ton of just individualized, bespoke moments all over that continent. So I would say like we tried to find a balance between the two things. And our game isn't necessarily like a game that is like really successful with complete proceduralization, I think has a completely sort of design philosophy that is targeting something else. I think ours, we want those individualized moments where there's like something really interesting, maybe it'll stick with you, like mentally you'll remember this scene because you've seen it, but usually those scenes came from us putting the time in and like really making an art piece, like an art set. So we tried to find the balance between the two. And in terms of pitfalls, like I think that's where it is. It's just not leaning too hard into one thing or leaning too hard into the other. I think you need to find something that works for everybody on your team. And I like doing the bespoke moments, but I also like facilitating the technology to make randomization, but make it look good. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was a great point, Josh. Sometimes like the proceduralization, running through a dungeon, you'll get a composition you would never imagine would come together, and you're like, wow, that looks awesome. And it's kind of a fun artist moment to see something like that. Yeah.
Speaking of kind of the technological side a little bit more, as far as constraints are concerned, when you're working on everything, how mindful do you have to be of constraints like memory, poly counts, frames per second, all of that? Or can you just go wild and let the person's computer that has, you know, $10,000 graphics card figure it out?
Yeah. Yeah, so we spent a lot of time, a lot of resources into making Diablo 4 as performant as we possibly could on the consoles and PCs, you know, that we could possibly support. It was a lot of extra work, as we touched on when Josh was showing Kyovashad. I mean, it's a big area, a lot of art pieces. And so there's a lot of consideration, a lot of time spent, many hours combing through files to make sure that we're not drawing in too much memory or too many vertices, and it's very much part of our process. Sometimes you can get a little loosey-goosey with this stuff, like if it's a big, you know, it's a field out in the middle of nowhere, there's not too much going on, there's not going to be too many players out there, it's not so closely monitored, but it's something I think we as a team value very highly, the performance of our game, and certainly something on interactives we look out for. It's something we're kind of a little bit we kind of dive in, and we want to make sure to the best of our ability that things play well.
So speaking of things that you're proud of and that you value, each one of you, what is your favorite thing that you got to work on in the game? You can, if you can't choose a number one, you could choose something that you really, really enjoy, but what was your favorite thing that you were able to work on? Like if somebody has a controller in their hand and you show them on the end of the screen, like, that was me, I did that.
Can I go?
Yes.
I did all the like gizmo interactives for the prison to the jail. So like when you like open, there's a rack that pulls people apart. There's this Iron Maiden people pop out of. There's a guillotine. Yeah, I still love that stuff.
Nice.
Do we all go? Oh, okay. Yeah, I can talk about mine. I think my favorite would be, I actually showed it in one of the slides. It was the raising bridge that comes out from the sand. That was pretty fun to work on. You know, it was actually all hand animated as well. There was no simulation or everything. Like, it was just straight up animation. Even the sand that kind of falls off from the bridge as it rises up. All that was, you know, hand animated, and I think that was one of the more first complex piece that I did work on when I was brought onto the team. Probably within the first year, I think, or a year and a half. But yeah, I think that one was one of my favorite for sure. I do wish it's, you know, used in more dungeons, but cool piece, yeah.
Yeah, for me, it was in general, the L kit that you saw at the beginning of the presentation. I think for me it was like establishing what like a culture kit for L could look like, you know, and doing all those kind of like very gore and tortured souls was like, I think, one of the pinnacles of my career.
Yeah, this is going to sound corny, but I just really enjoyed watching this whole game come together and watching every artist on this panel and back at the in Irvine and Albany and in Texas and wherever, and you know, we're making Diablo 4. It's a huge effort, but just seeing it all come together and watching each interactives artist here improve, and I get a bit of good feelings when they get that much better, when they make an asset that much cooler, explode a little bit better, animate, give that feedback. You know, Luciano's hell assets, when they animate and you open the chest and there's, you know, gore flying everywhere, it's fantastic. So I know it's a bit of a corny answer, but I would say it's really other people's moments I enjoy the most.
Very cool. We did have a basic logistical question, which is, in total, how many people are in your team, like fully?
On interactives, yeah, including myself, we have 14 people, which is you know, quite a big team actually. When I started on StarCraft 2, I think the whole art team was like 15, 16 people. So, so it's a large project, but interactives is kind of actually a smaller group within the exterior art subdiscipline. So we're not gigantic, but I like to make sure everybody gels well and that we have a great team composition. So part of that is keeping a fun, tight-knit group.
And then finally, once again, for each one of you, what was your biggest takeaway from this game? What is the thing that you learned that you came in and you didn't quite know, but when you left, you were like, wow, that is a great nugget to have for the rest of my career?
Josh.
I think I have a unique perspective on this because it's there from the start, but it was seeing how a project, from being a person who's been in the industry for a while, like I saw, like, I was on, sorry, here's my little quick thing. I was on Aliens RPG, that got canned. I was on Titan, that got canned. And then I was on Legacy of the Void, and that actually came out, but it wasn't a big game, right? So seeing Diablo, it was like, when I first joined the team, Chaz was just saying like 15 people, there's like 40 people total when I first joined the game. And watching the process of the development, where I don't know, we have like 1,000 people? I don't know, something. There's a lot of people.
Not that many people. But
I don't know. There's a lot. There's more than 50 or 40. So, but just seeing the process to make these AAA games, like, they're big projects. There's a lot of moving wheels, but watching a core team with a strong idea, like our art director was like, Old Masters Pillar, design was like, we're doing this. Everybody was sort of focused, and watching that, it was like setting it out to sea, and it just cruised right exactly where it was supposed to go, more or less. It was really cool. It's super cool to see that.
Cool. I guess for me, it's, you know, like I said earlier, you know, this is my actually my first commercial game, and the biggest takeaway for myself is just the sheer amount of work, dedication, talent that goes into making a game. You know, it's like when I was in college, I started a project called Panelists where I was working on it with like literally about 30 of my friends that I was able to recruit. And you know, back then I was like still a student, right? But to me, we were like, oh yeah, we're making a game. It's cool. You know, we put it on itch.io. You know, like we can make a game. You know, which we did. You know, but then like once I came into the industry, I was like, wow, there's so much more detail that actually goes into all the individual crafting of literally every pixel you see on the game. You know, so like I said, like, you know, from the big statues that Luciano was showing to literally the small pots, right? Sometimes it takes up like, I don't know, 10 pixels. Everything, every little detail is accounted for, and someone's thinking about it. Someone's working on a system to make it better, you know? So it's just, you know, really the sheer amount of dedication and heart that people pour into making a game, you know, it's incredible, yeah.
Yeah, so for me, I think it's a little bit different. I think the thing that profoundly hit me was when I joined the team, the incredible amount of trust everyone from the director shows in your ability, and the confidence you have to bring up something that works in the Diablo universe. I think that's really one of the things that stand up to me more. Yeah.
Yeah, my answer is a little bit like Josh's. Alignment is huge. I can't stress that enough. If any of you go on to make games, and I hope you all do, keeping a group of people on course with the same idea over an extended amount of time is incredibly difficult and incredibly important to have a thoroughness, a plan, consistency, a vision. I think I hopefully speak for everybody here when they say, when they watch a great movie and they see the director come through the work, or when they play a great game and you see one vision come through the video game, and that permeates the experience. You get the feeling, it's consistent. That means that there was great alignment. That means that we all had to give up a little bit of our own idea to bring together this concise vision for a game like Diablo, or really any great piece of art. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for that. And one more round of applause for the Props and Interactive team from Diablo 4. And that's it. We did it again. Another fantastic Gnomon live stream. If you're interested on what Gnomon is and finding out more about us, go ahead and visit us at gnomon.edu. You can also check us out on all our socials at gnomon_school. And if you want to find out what Gnomon can do for you, go ahead and send us an email at admissions@gnomon.edu. And that's it. Now I'm going to go ahead and beg for some prime currency so that way I can get all those fancy skins that I've been hoping for. And I'll see y'all later. Bye.